In a quiet neighborhood nestled on the outskirts of Los Angeles, a family believed they had found their forever home. Sarah, Mark, and their teenage son Ethan had spent years building a life filled with joy, laughter, and precious memories. The walls of their modest home had witnessed everything, from the first steps of their son to the late-night laughter shared around the dining table. To them, this house wasn't just a place. It was their sanctuary, their safe haven in a chaotic world. But sometimes, life has a way of shattering the illusion of safety. Beneath the surface of their tranquil lives, an invisible threat loomed, a storm they could neither predict nor control. And it all began with a single envelope in the mail. The day had started like any other. Sarah was tending to her garden, her hands gently brushing against the lavender bushes she had planted years ago. Inside, Mark was sipping his coffee, going through a stack of bills on the counter. Their son Ethan was sprawled out on the couch, headphones on, oblivious to the world around him. The peace of that ordinary day was broken when Sarah walked in, holding a letter that would change everything. "Mark," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You need to see this." She handed him the envelope, her hands shaking slightly. The words "policy cancellation effective immediately" were printed in bold letters across the top. After years of faithfully paying their insurance premiums, the company had decided their home was no longer worth the risk. At first, they didn't understand. Why now? They had done everything right, paid their bills on time, followed every rule. But as they read further, the explanation became clear. Their neighborhood had been classified as a high-risk fire zone, and the company had chosen to cut its losses. To them, Sarah and Mark were just another statistic, another red mark on a risk assessment sheet. Mark clenched his fists, anger boiling beneath the surface. "They can't just drop us like this," he said, pacing back and forth. "We've been with them for over a decade." But deep down, he knew that fighting the decision would be like shouting into the void. The system wasn't built for people like them. It was built to protect the corporations, not the families who depended on them. Sarah tried to hold back tears as she looked out the window. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the neighborhood. But it wasn't just the sunset. On the distant horizon, a plume of smoke was rising, a chilling reminder of how close the fires were. In another part of the city, Jake sat in his office, staring at his computer screen. A mid-level insurance adjuster, Jake was responsible for enforcing the very policies that were causing families like Sarah and Mark to lose everything. He wasn't proud of his job, but he told himself it was just business. It was easier to focus on numbers and spreadsheets than to think about the lives those numbers represented. But even Jake couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. The more files he reviewed, the more he realized how widespread the cancellations were. Hundreds of families were being left vulnerable, their safety stripped away when they needed it most. He wanted to speak up, but every time he tried, he was met with the same cold response. "Jake, stick to the system. This isn't your problem." Back in their home, Sarah and Mark began preparing for the worst. They packed bags, gathered important documents, and made a plan to evacuate if the fires came any closer. But no amount of preparation could ease the growing tension in their household. Ethan, their teenage son, refused to accept what was happening. "We can't just leave," he said, his voice breaking. "This house is everything to us. It's not fair." Mark placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his voice heavy with emotion. "I know, buddy, but sometimes life isn't fair. What matters is that we stick together. As long as we have each other, we'll get through this." But even as he spoke, Mark couldn't shake the fear that they were on the brink of losing everything. The fires weren't just consuming trees and homes, they were exposing cracks in the very systems people trusted. Sarah and Mark had always believed that their insurance would be there for them in times of crisis. Now, they were forced to face the harsh reality that the system was built to protect profits, not people. And yet, this story isn't just about loss. It's about resilience. It's about a family's fight for survival, a man's struggle with his conscience, and the power of courage in the face of devastation. It's about what happens when the flames aren't the only enemy, and betrayal comes from the very people you trusted to keep you safe. What would you do if the system abandoned you? If the safety you paid for disappeared when you needed it most? This is the story of what happens when fire meets injustice, and it's one you won't forget. If this story has gripped your heart so far, don't stop now. Like, share, and subscribe to Heart Stories to follow this journey of survival, redemption, and hope. Together, we'll uncover the truth, one story at a time. And don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss an update. Let's begin. The first sign came quietly, almost unnoticed. It was a simple letter, folded neatly in an envelope with the logo of their insurance company stamped on the front. Sarah placed it on the kitchen counter, intending to open it later, thinking it was just another policy update. But later turned into days, and days turned into weeks, until one morning. As she cleared the counter of old mail, she decided to finally take a look. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. At first, the words didn't register. It was a standard letter, filled with legal jargon and corporate formality. But as her eyes scanned the page, one sentence stood out, sharp and cold, effective immediately. Your policy has been terminated. Sarah's heart sank. She read it again, hoping she had misunderstood. But the meaning was clear. Her family no longer had insurance coverage. She rushed to Mark, who was working on their car in the driveway. "Mark, you need to see this," she said, her voice shaking. He wiped his hands on a rag and took the letter, frowning as he read it. Policy terminated. Fire risk assessment. Inability to continue coverage, he muttered under his breath. "This can't be happening," he said finally, his voice filled with disbelief. The family had always paid their premiums on time, never missed a payment, and followed every rule, but none of that mattered. To the insurance company, they were just numbers on a spreadsheet. Their home, located in what was now classified as a high-risk fire zone, was deemed uninsurable. No exceptions, no appeals. Miles away, in a glass-walled office building, Jake sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen. His job was simple, or so it seemed. Review risk assessments, approve policy terminations, and move on to the next file. But recently, the sheer volume of cancellations had started to bother him. Family after family, home after home, their policies were being terminated with no warning. He knew the company's reasoning, minimizing exposure to financial loss in fire-prone areas. But the human cost of those decisions was something he couldn't ignore. Jake's boss, a man named Charles, had made it clear that questioning the system was not an option. "We're running a business, not a charity," Charles had said during a recent meeting. "If they're in a fire zone, they're a liability. End of discussion." Jake had nodded along like everyone else. But deep down, he felt a knot of guilt growing tighter with each new cancellation he processed. One of those cancellations was for Sarah and Mark's home. Jake remembered the file clearly. The system had flagged it as high risk due to its location near a wildfire-prone area. He had clicked approve without hesitation, just like he had done 100 times before. But now, as the fires grew closer, and the news was filled with stories of families losing everything, Jake began to wonder if he had made the right choice. Back at the family's home, the tension was palpable. Sarah couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw flames consuming their house, reducing their memories to ash. Mark tried to stay calm, reassuring her that everything would be fine, but even he couldn't hide his fear. The news didn't help. Reports of wildfires spreading uncontrollably across the state were everywhere. Entire neighborhoods were being evacuated. Homes were being lost. Lives were being shattered. Ethan, their teenage son, was perhaps the most affected. He had grown up in this house. To him, it wasn't just a building, it was his world. "Why can't we just get another insurance company?" he asked one night during dinner. Sarah sighed, trying to explain. "It's not that simple. Ethan, no one wants to insure a home in this area anymore. It's too risky." Ethan slammed his fork down, his frustration boiling over. "So, what? We just give up? Let the house burn down? His words hung in the air, heavy and bitter. A few days later, the first real warning arrived. A strong wind blew through the neighborhood, carrying the faint but unmistakable smell of smoke. The air felt heavier, hotter. Sarah looked out the window and saw a thin plume of smoke rising in the distance. It was far away, but it was a reminder of how quickly things could change. She called Mark, who was at work, and told him what she had seen. "It's nothing to worry about," he said, trying to reassure her, but Sarah could hear the worry in his voice. That night, they packed a small bag with essentials, just in case. Important documents, a few changes of clothes, some family photos. "We'll probably never need this," Mark said as he zipped up the bag. But deep down, they both knew it was better to be prepared. Ethan, however, refused to pack anything. "I'm not leaving," he said stubbornly. "This is our home. I'm not running away from it." Meanwhile, Jake was grappling with his own crisis of conscience. He had always told himself that his job was just a job, that the decisions he made weren't personal. But now, with the fires spreading and the stories of devastation piling up, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was part of the problem. He thought about Sarah and Mark, though he didn't know their names. To him, they were just a case number, one of many, but the idea that they might lose everything because of a decision he had made haunted him. One evening, Jake stayed late at the office, scrolling through files of cancelled policies. He found Sarah and Mark's file and opened it. There was a note from the system. High-risk area. Recommend immediate termination. He stared at the words, feeling a mix of anger and shame. He had clicked approve without thinking twice. Now, he wondered if there was anything he could do to make it right. As the fires crept closer, the tension reached a breaking point. The family argued more. Ethan's anger turned to fear. Mark's confidence began to crumble. And Sarah, the glue that held them together, started to feel like she was falling apart. At the same time, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He didn't know how or if it would work, but he knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. The warning signs were all there, the smoke, the heat, the cancellations. But the question remained, when the flames arrived, would anyone be ready to face them? The night was unusually quiet. The distant hum of cicadas and the rustle of leaves in the wind seemed almost soothing. But Sarah couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. She stood by the window, staring out at the horizon. What she saw made her blood run cold, a faint orange glow in the distance, flickering like a warning signal. The fires were closer than she had thought. Mark joined her, his face lined with worry. "It's still far enough," he said, trying to sound confident, but they both knew the truth. Wildfires could travel fast, devouring everything in their path in a matter of hours. They didn't have time to wait. The next morning, the winds picked up, carrying ash and embers that rained down like snowflakes. The orange glow had become a roaring inferno, visible from their backyard. Emergency alerts buzzed on their phones, warning residents to prepare for evacuation. The smell of smoke was overwhelming now, seeping into the walls and furniture, making it impossible to ignore the danger. "We need to leave," Sarah said, grabbing the bag they had packed earlier. But Ethan resisted, standing in the doorway with tears in his eyes. "We can't just abandon our home. We've lived here my whole life." His voice cracked, and Sarah knelt down, placing her hands on his shoulders. "Ethan," she said softly, "I know how much this house means to you, but your safety is more important. We can't replace you." Reluctantly, Ethan nodded, but his heartbreak was evident. Mark loaded the bag into their car as Sarah ushered Max, their golden retriever, into the back seat. The family climbed in, the engine roared to life, and they began their drive away from the only home they had ever known. The roads were packed with cars, all heading in the same direction, away from the fire. Horns blared, and the tension in the air was palpable. People were yelling, trying to navigate through the gridlocked streets. Sarah looked out the window, watching families clutching their pets, their belongings, and whatever hope they had left. Suddenly, a spark of panic shot through her. "Max!" she exclaimed. "Where's Max?" She turned around to see the dog wasn't in the car. In the chaos, he had somehow escaped. "Pull over!" she shouted. Mark reluctantly stopped the car, and before anyone could protest, Ethan bolted out, running back toward their house. "Ethan?" "No!" Sarah screamed. But it was too late. Ethan disappeared into the smoke and chaos, determined to save his best friend. Sarah and Mark followed on foot, the heat of the fire pressing against their skin as they ran back toward the danger they had just escaped. When they reached the house, it was already surrounded by smoke. Flames licked at the edges of their yard, threatening to consume everything. Ethan was inside, calling out for Max. "Come on! Boy, where are you?" His voice was frantic, echoing through the empty halls. Mark charged in, coughing as the smoke filled his lungs. He found Ethan in the living room, clutching Max tightly in his arms. "We have to go. Now!" Mark shouted. Together, they stumbled out of the house, the flames just feet behind them. As they reached the street, the house erupted into a fiery blaze, the roof collapsing in a deafening roar. They had escaped, but their home, the place where they had built their lives, was gone. Meanwhile, in the office of the insurance company, Jake was glued to the news. Footage of the fires showed neighborhoods in ruins, families standing in shock as their homes burned to the ground. Jake recognized one of those families, Sarah. Mark and Ethan. Their file flashed in his mind, the decision to terminate their policy haunting him like a ghost. He couldn't sit by any longer. Jake gathered every piece of evidence he could find, emails, risk assessments, internal memos, and printed them out. The company's deliberate strategy to abandon high-risk areas was clear in black and white. He knew that sharing this information could cost him his job, but he didn't care anymore. He had to make it right. Jake reached out to Sarah and Mark through a mutual contact. When they met in a coffee shop, the family was visibly shaken, their clothes still smelling faintly of smoke. Jake introduced himself nervously. "I'm the one who approved the cancellation of your policy," he admitted. Mark's fists clenched, but Sarah placed a hand on his arm, urging him to listen. "I didn't realize the impact of what I was doing," Jake continued. "But I know now that it was wrong. The company, my company, knew this would happen. They knew families like yours would be left with nothing, and I want to help you fight back." Mark's voice was cold. "Why should we trust you?" Jake handed them the files he had printed out. "Because this isn't just about you. It's about every family who's been betrayed. If we work together, we can hold them accountable." With Jake's help, the family filed a lawsuit against the insurance company, accusing them of negligence and unethical practices. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting images of Sarah and Mark standing in front of the smoldering remains of their home. Their story resonated with thousands, sparking outrage and calls for reform. The company tried to silence them, offering a settlement in exchange for their silence. But Sarah and Mark refused. "This isn't about money," Sarah said during a televised interview. "This is about justice, for our family and for everyone else who's been abandoned." The fire had taken their home, but it couldn't take their resolve. With Jake's testimony and the support of a growing movement, the family was prepared to face the company head-on. But would their courage be enough to bring down a giant? Or would the system, once again, protect itself at the expense of the people it was supposed to serve? The fire didn't just consume homes and trees, it devoured dreams, memories, and the sense of safety that so many families had taken for granted. For Sarah, Mark, and Ethan, the smoldering ruins of their home stood as a haunting reminder of what they had lost. The house where Ethan had taken his first steps, where Sarah had planted her first garden, where Mark had built a life for his family, was now reduced to ash and rubble. They stood on the edge of the destruction, holding each other tightly. Ethan clutched Max, their golden retriever, who had miraculously survived the chaos. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she whispered, "We're safe." That's all that matters. But deep inside, they all knew it wasn't enough. They weren't just grieving the loss of their home, they were mourning the betrayal that had left them unprotected in their hour of need. In the days that followed, the reality of their situation began to sink in. Without insurance, there was no way to rebuild. The emergency shelters were overcrowded, filled with other families who had suffered the same fate. The air was thick with grief and frustration as people shared their stories. Families abandoned by the very companies they had trusted to protect them. Mark, usually the pillar of strength for his family, began to unravel. He spent hours pacing outside the shelter, trying to find answers, solutions, anything. "This isn't right," he said to Sarah one night. "We did everything we were supposed to. We paid our premiums. We followed the rules, and now we're left with nothing." His voice cracked, and for the first time in years, Sarah saw him cry. Ethan, too, struggled to cope. The loss of his home, his sense of stability, weighed heavily on him. He withdrew, spending hours sitting alone with Max, staring at the horizon. Sarah tried to reach out to him, but her words felt hollow. "How do I tell my son that everything will be okay?" she thought, "when I don't even believe it myself?" Meanwhile, Jake was facing his own crisis. After meeting with Sarah and Mark and hearing their story firsthand, he couldn't shake the guilt that had taken root in his heart. Every time he looked at their file, he felt a pang of regret. He had been part of the system that had destroyed their lives. And now he was determined to make it right. Jake spent hours digging through company records, uncovering emails and documents that painted a damning picture of the company's practices. He found evidence of deliberate strategies to cut off high-risk areas, internal memos prioritizing profits over people, and even instructions to deny coverage retroactively in certain cases. The deeper he dug, the angrier he became. But his actions didn't go unnoticed. One evening, as Jake was leaving the office, his boss, Charles, stopped him. "Jake, I hear you've been looking into old files," Charles said, his tone icy. "You need to be careful. This isn't your fight." Jake met his gaze, his jaw tightening. "It is my fight," he said, "because I can't sit by and watch families lose everything while we profit off their pain." The tension came to a head when Jake was called into a meeting with senior executives. They presented him with a non-disclosure agreement, offering a substantial severance package in exchange for his silence. "Sign this, and we'll forget about your curiosity," Charles said, sliding the document across the table. Jake stared at the paper, his hands trembling. He thought about Sarah, Mark, and Ethan. He thought about all the other families who had been abandoned. "Erotin, no," Jake said, pushing the paper back. "I won't be a part of this anymore." Charles's face darkened. "You're making a mistake," he said. But Jake didn't care. He walked out of the office, knowing he had just burned every bridge behind him. But for the first time in months, he felt free. Jake reached out to Sarah and Mark, this time not just with words but with actions. He handed them a folder filled with evidence, emails, memos, risk assessments, all proving the company's deliberate neglect. "This is everything you need to hold them accountable," he said. Mark flipped through the pages, his eyes widening. This could change everything," he said. With Jake's help, the family filed a lawsuit against the insurance company, alleging negligence, fraud, and breach of contract. The case quickly gained attention, with news outlets picking up the story. Sarah and Mark found themselves in front of cameras, sharing their story with the world. "We're not just fighting for ourselves," Sarah said during an interview. "We're fighting for every family who has been abandoned and betrayed." The lawsuit sparked outrage. Thousands of people came forward with similar stories, sharing how they had been left unprotected in their time of need. Protests erupted outside the insurance company's headquarters, with people holding signs that read, "People over profits and we deserve better." The public pressure was mounting, and the company's executives found themselves scrambling to control the narrative. But the fight wasn't easy. The company's legal team was ruthless, using every tactic to discredit Sarah and Mark. They argued that the family should have known the risks of living in a fire-prone area, that the cancellation was within their rights. But Sarah refused to back down. "This isn't just about us," she said during a deposition. "It's about holding them accountable for the lives they've destroyed." As the case moved forward, Sarah and Mark began to see glimmers of hope. Their story had inspired a movement, and people from all walks of life were rallying behind them. Donations poured in, helping the family cover legal fees and rebuild their lives. Even Ethan, who had struggled so much in the aftermath of the fire, began to find his strength again. "We're not just victims," he said one day. "We're fighters." The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Jake took the stand, his testimony a damning indictment of the company's practices. "We knew the risks," he said, his voice steady, "and we chose profits over people. But it's time to make things right." Sarah and Mark watched from their seats, their hearts pounding. This was their chance to finally hold the company accountable. But the question lingered: would justice prevail, or would the system protect itself once again? The fight was far from over. But one thing was clear: this family wasn't backing down. And with Jake by their side, they were ready to face whatever came next. The trial was not just a legal battle, it was a fight for justice, a chance for Sarah, Mark, and countless others to reclaim their dignity after being betrayed by a system they had trusted. The courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, and families who shared similar stories of loss. The stakes were higher than ever, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. On one side of the room sat the corporate attorneys, their suits immaculate, their faces stoic. They represented an institution with immense resources and influence, a behemoth that had crushed challengers before. On the other side was Sarah and Mark, flanked by Jake and their small but determined legal team. They were outnumbered and outfunded, but they had something the corporation didn't: the truth. The company's lawyers wasted no time attacking the family's credibility. They painted the fire as an unavoidable act of nature, claiming the company had acted within its rights to cancel policies in high-risk areas. "It's not about blame," their lead attorney said in his opening statement. "It's about understanding the realities of operating in an increasingly dangerous world." But Sarah's attorney countered with compelling evidence. Emails from corporate executives showed a clear pattern of prioritizing profits over people. Memos revealed that the company had calculated the cost of lawsuits and found it cheaper to risk litigation than to honor policies. Jake's testimony was the turning point. "We knew these families would be left with nothing," Jake said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But the decision was made to protect the bottom line. I approved hundreds of cancellations, including Sarah and Mark's, because that was my job. But it wasn't right." His words hung in the air, a powerful indictment of the system. Sarah took the stand, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with each word. She described the night of the fire, the panic, the helplessness, the heartbreak of watching their home burn while knowing they had no safety net. "We did everything we were supposed to," she said, her eyes meeting the jury's. "We paid our premiums. We trusted them. And when we needed them the most, they abandoned us." Other families testified as well, sharing similar stories of betrayal and loss. A father recounted how his children had to sleep in their car after their home was destroyed. An elderly woman described losing the house she had lived in for over 50 years. The courtroom became a space not just for legal arguments, but for the collective grief and anger of a community that had been wronged. As the trial progressed, the corporation's defense began to crumble. Their attempts to dismiss Jake's testimony as the words of a disgruntled employee failed spectacularly when the jury saw the mountain of evidence he had provided. Every email, every memo, every risk assessment painted a clear picture of deliberate negligence. The executives squirmed in their seats as their decisions were laid bare for the world to see. In a desperate move, the company's lead attorney offered a settlement, a significant payout in exchange for Sarah and Mark dropping the case and signing a non-disclosure agreement. It was tempting, money that could rebuild their lives and secure their future. But Sarah refused. "This isn't about money," she said firmly. This is about accountability. After weeks of emotional testimonies and heated arguments, the jury reached a verdict. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the foreperson stood and read the decision. "We find the defendant liable for negligence and breach of contract," she said. The room erupted in gasps and cheers. For the first time in months, Sarah and Mark felt a glimmer of hope. The court awarded significant damages to the family, but more importantly, the ruling set a precedent. The insurance company was ordered to reinstate policies for thousands of families in high-risk areas and to implement new guidelines ensuring greater transparency and fairness. The decision was a landmark moment, sending shockwaves through the industry. News of the verdict spread quickly, dominating headlines and sparking conversations across the country. Activists hailed it as a victory for ordinary people against corporate greed. Social media was flooded with messages of support, as well as calls for further reform in the insurance industry. Sarah and Mark became unlikely heroes, their story inspiring others to stand up and demand better. Jake's role in the case also earned him widespread recognition. While some criticized him for breaking ranks, many praised his courage in exposing the truth. "I didn't do this to be a hero," he said in an interview. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." With the damages awarded by the court, Sarah and Mark were able to start rebuilding their lives. They decided to stay in the same community, determined not to let the fire take more than it already had. Their new home was smaller, simpler, but it was filled with the same love and resilience that had carried them through their darkest days. Ethan, who had struggled so much after the fire, found a renewed sense of purpose. He started volunteering with a local organization that helped families affected by wildfires, sharing his own story to inspire others. "What happened to us was devastating," he said, "but it doesn't have to define us." After the trial, Jake left the insurance industry. He used his severance package to start a non-profit organization dedicated to helping families navigate the complexities of insurance and hold corporations accountable. "No one should have to go through what Sarah and Mark went through," he said. "This is my way of making sure that doesn't happen again." The organization quickly gained traction, drawing support from people across the country. Jake's decision to turn his guilt into action became a powerful example of redemption and the impact of standing up for what's right. The trial was over, but the fight for change had just begun. Sarah and Mark continued to advocate for stronger consumer protections, speaking at events and sharing their story with policymakers. Their experience became a catalyst for reform, inspiring new legislation aimed at preventing future betrayals by the insurance industry. In the end, the fire had taken so much from them, but it had also revealed their strength, their resilience, and their ability to transform tragedy into something greater. Their story wasn't just about loss, it was about hope, justice, and the power of standing together. Months had passed since the verdict, but the echoes of the trial continued to reverberate. For Sarah, Mark, and Ethan, life had taken on a new rhythm, not one of rebuilding what they had lost, but of creating something new from the ashes. Their journey had been painful, filled with challenges that tested their faith and resilience. Yet, they had emerged stronger, more united, and determined to make a difference. Their new home, though modest, was a testament to their perseverance. The walls were bare, the furniture simple, but it was a place of peace. Sarah often stood in the kitchen, gazing out the window at the garden she was slowly bringing back to life. It reminded her of the first home they had lost, but also of the strength it had taken to let go and move forward. For Mark, the fight for justice had ignited a new purpose. He became a vocal advocate for wildfire-affected families, using his story to push for reforms in the insurance industry. He spoke at community meetings, testified before lawmakers, and joined grassroots organizations, fighting for transparency and accountability. "What happened to us shouldn't happen to anyone else," or he often said. "We can't change the past, but we can build a better future." Sarah found healing in her connections with others. She volunteered at shelters, helping displaced families navigate the aftermath of loss. Her compassion and strength inspired many, and she became a source of comfort and guidance for those who felt overwhelmed by their circumstances. "I've been where you are," she would say, And I promise, you're stronger than you think." Oh, Ethan, now older and wiser, had turned his pain into action. His experience gave him a voice, and he used it to raise awareness about the impact of wildfires on young people. He started a local youth group focused on rebuilding efforts, teaching kids how to plant trees, restore burned land, and support their communities. For the first time, he felt a sense of purpose that extended beyond himself. Jake, the man who once sat silently in the shadows of corporate greed, had become a symbol of redemption. His non-profit organization had grown rapidly, helping countless families challenge unfair practices by insurance companies. "Every file I approved," he once said, "was a person, a family, a story, and I'll spend the rest of my life making it right." One day, Jake visited Sarah and Mark's new home. He stood in their living room, looking around at the life they had rebuilt. "This is what it's all about," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "Jake, you gave us the courage to fight back. None of this would have been possible without you." For Jake, their gratitude was humbling. He had started his journey as an employee following orders, but now he was a man driven by purpose, determined to use his experience to protect others from suffering the same fate. The verdict in Sarah and Mark's case didn't just change their lives, it sparked a nationwide movement. Families across the country began sharing their stories, demanding accountability from corporations that had abandoned them. Social media campaigns gained traction, with hashtags like "People Over Profits" and "Justice for Families" trending for weeks. Policymakers took notice. New legislation was introduced, aimed at holding insurance companies to higher standards of transparency and fairness. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start, a step toward a world where people could trust the systems meant to protect them. In the end, the fire that had once symbolized destruction became a catalyst for change. It brought out the worst in a system built on greed, but it also revealed the best in people, their courage, compassion, and determination to stand together in the face of adversity. Sarah and Mark's story became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, there is light to be found. For their family, the journey wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation. They had lost everything, but they had gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that they were stronger than they ever imagined. And now, we turn the question to you. What would you do if faced with a similar situation? How would you fight for what matters most to you? Would you find the strength to rise from the ashes, just as Sarah, Mark, and Ethan did? We want to hear your thoughts. Share your stories in the comments below, your experiences, your challenges, your triumphs. Together, we can inspire each other and build a community of hope and resilience. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and most importantly, subscribe to Heart Stories. By subscribing, you're not just supporting our channel, you're joining a movement to uncover the truth, fight for justice, and celebrate the incredible strength of the human spirit. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time, stay strong, stay hopeful, and remember, even in the darkest of times, there's always a way to rise again. This is not just a story of survival, it's a story of transformation. And it's a story that reminds us all of what it means to fight for what truly matters. Thank you for watching Heart Stories. We'll see you in the next chapter.